Now let's get into the cannabis plant itself. So we know the history of marijuana. Let's talk a little bit about the terminology. Cannabis refers to the genus of flowering plants in the family Cannabicae. Um, and while hemp and marijuana are regularly referred to as a species or strains of cannabis, they actually don't qualify as either one. In fact, they couldn't technically be considered plants at all. Hemp and marijuana are just simply broad classifications of cannabis that were adopted into our culture. However, they're not legitimate nomenclature for the cannabis plant. So, to kind of clarify the difference between hemp and marijuana and clear the smoke on this frequently misinformed subject, we're going to explore what each of these terms actually means and how they're related to cannabis. So, marijuana refers specifically to the flowering buds and the leaves of the cannabis plant. This term is used to classify the varieties of cannabis that contain more than 0.3% of THC by dry weight, and that induces the psychotropic or euphoric effects of the user. And while this term is used widespread throughout American culture, it presents a grossly inadequate misrepresentation of cannabis. Most informed individuals and organizations in the cannabis industry refuse to use the term, and they consider it to be racist. In early American history, the term marijuana was non existent, and cannabis was the primary term used to classify the plant. And between 1910 and 1920, nearly a million Mexicans migrated to the US seeking refuge from the Mexican Revolution. And during that time, anti Mexican sentiment had begun to steep, and the term marijuana arose as a negative correlation of use by the Mexican immigrants. So, what is hemp? Hemp is the term that's used to classify varieties of cannabis that contain 0.3% or less of THC content by dry weight. And while the legal definition described had not been really legitimized until the Agricultural Act of 2018, hemp has generally been used to describe the non intoxicating cannabis that is harvested for industrial use of its derived products. Hemp is the strongest natural fiber in the world with over 50,000 known uses, including textiles like clothes and diapers and handbags, industrial textiles like rope and canvas and carpet, paper, food like hemp seed oil, hemp protein powder, building materials like solvents, insulation, fiberglass substitutes, oil paints, and for body care like soap, shampoos, lotions, cosmetics, etc. So the defining characteristic between the two is based on a single factor, the amount of THC in the plant, or rather whether it will get the user high. So while the intoxicating properties of each plant is an important factor to consider, categorizing cannabis as either hemp or marijuana based on a single characteristic presents this skewed portrayal of cannabis which prevents users from fully understanding its diversity. So the flower contains the CBD and the terpenes that cause you to get high and that give the people a number of other benefits. And it interacts with the endocannabinoid system. And flowers only grow on the female plants. And this is what is dried out and ground before being smoked. The cola on the cannabis plant is a cluster of buds that grow closely together, almost in a bunch. So small colas can be found up and down the low branches, but the main cola almost always sits at the top of the marijuana plant. The pistil is where the reproductive part of the flower sits. They contain a lot of very thin strands, and it looks a little bit like hair, called stigmas, and they collect the pollen that's carried from the male plants. And the stigmas can be found within the plant. They're white, and when the plant is young, eventually it grows up and it turns yellow through the weed plant stages. The pistil is all about the reproductive system of the marijuana. Then we have the bracts. The bracts are what we find around the female reproductive area. They're green with leaves in a sort of tear shape, and they have a number of resin glands that actually hold the highest number of cannabinoids within the marijuana plant. And the calyx is inside the bracts on the female cannabis plant. This is the see-through layer that protects the ovule. You can't see it with the naked eye. Then we have the trichomes. These are small, but they form an important part of the marijuana anatomy. They make a crystal-like covering for the buds of the cannabis. And trichomes actually come from the glands on the leaves, the stems, and the calyx of the female or the male plants. And the trichomes protect the plant from anything in the wild that could harm them. They secrete terpenes and both CBD and THC. Then we have the node. The node is where the branch grows from the stem of the cannabis plant, or where one branch stems off and creates another. Some nodes contain buds, but not all of them, and the nodes play an important role in the sexing of the cannabis plant and tell a male cannabis plant from a female cannabis plant. And then we have the fan leaves. If you see clothing or accessories with a cannabis leaf on them as decoration, this is going to be from the fan leaves. They actually just capture the light and they don't have a lot of resin within them. And on the sativa plant, the leaves tend to be further apart and more sparse. Then we have sugar leaves. These are where the resin is usually held. They're small leaves where the buds form, and you can use them in a variety of cannabis products, including pre-rolls or to make the THC or the CBD extracts. And then we have the stem, and this is a term you're probably familiar with. The stem is the same part of the cannabis plant as any other plant, and it gives the structure and the stability to the other parts of the plant. And the top of the stem can be cut off to encourage weed plant stages where the marijuana plant grows more branches and more buds. So to check the sex of the cannabis plant, you need to understand marijuana anatomy. You should check in between the nodes. There are parts of the marijuana plant where the branches spring off from a stem. And on the male plants, the pollen sacs can be found here. And on the female, the stigma develops so that they can catch the pollen. So you can see pre-flowers from around the 4th week of cannabis growth. In week 6, it should definitely be clear what sex the plants are. And for the marijuana plant, the male plant, you find small sacs growing. On females, you'll find bracts on the cannabis plants. And this is where the hairs are that catch the pollen will eventually start to grow. So to give you a comparison, consider the taxonomic hierarchy of fruits in the citrus species. Categorizing cannabis as either hemp or marijuana is akin to classifying all fruits in the citrus genus as either sweet or sour, without really acknowledging the diverse characteristics of each fruit. So in addition, hemp and marijuana can often appear indistinguishable from one another. And this has already led to numerous issues of law enforcement officers making arrests and seizing hemp that's 100% legal because it looks exactly like marijuana. The classification of hemp or marijuana absent of a true understanding of cannabis presents a clear issue of function. And the obvious solution is for these words to have never existed. But now that these terms have become deeply ingrained in our society, this problem is difficult to reverse. So the only realistic solution is to re-educate our society over time. The 4 key differences between hemp and marijuana are composition, legality, cultivation, and usage. And so talking about the composition, the defining characteristic between hemp and marijuana is the chemical composition that's contained within each plant. Both hemp and marijuana can produce high amounts of CBD, which is the non-intoxicating cannabis compound. However, THC is produced at very different levels. And so while hemp can contain no more than 0.3% THC, marijuana can contain way more than that. And then the legality, due to the difference between their levels of THC, hemp and marijuana are regulated very differently under the law. While hemp was previously regulated as an illegal substance under the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, It was removed as an illegal substance under the Agricultural Improvement Act of 2018. And that federally legalized hemp and the hemp-derived products that contain no more than that 0.3% THC. And then with cultivation, hemp and marijuana are harvested for different purposes, so naturally they require different growing conditions. Marijuana varieties are selectively bred in controlled environments, which are designed to optimize the breed's characteristics and produce female plants that yield the budding flowers. So to properly cultivate a marijuana or a cannabis plant, the grower must pay close attention to the plant at each stage of its life cycle and maintain the exact conditions in its environment, like proper temperature, lighting, humidity, so on. So in contrast, hemp is just grown to maximize its size and its yield. So to achieve this, the hemp is typically grown outdoors and does not require the level of control and attention that's necessary to grow marijuana. And then the last one is the usage. Obviously, hemp and marijuana each offer a range of usages which are unique to their composition. And THC is a powerful psychoactive agent that can directly bind to the CB1 and CB2 receptors in the endocannabinoid system. And that induces the mind-altering euphoric effects that we refer to as being high. While marijuana is commonly recognized for its recreational uses, studies have revealed its potential in a wide variety of therapeutic applications. In comparison, hemp is just harvested to produce a wide variety of products. And there's hundreds of strains of cannabis plants out there, and the three main species of plants are the most commonly grown. So let's talk about the origin of indica and sativa. In 1753, Carl Linus published Species Plantarum, and he classified all the cannabis plants under one group, Cannabis sativa L, with cannabis as the genus and sativa as the species, and L indicating the Linnaeus system. Sativa comes from the Latin sativum, meaning cultivated. And you can see this person pictured on the left. And then on the right is French biologist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. And he updated the naming in 1785 with two distinct species, Cannabis sativa, which is a taller, lankier, and more fibrous plant, and Cannabis indica, a shorter, stouter, and more psychoactive plant. And its name meaning from India, where it was thought to originate. And these definitions largely refer to each weed's type, physical structure, and they're still being used today. So we know that there's these three main parts now. The first two we've already identified, but then we have another one, which is ruderalis. We'll discuss indicas and sativas in a moment, but let's look at the species ruderalis for a moment. This species of cannabis is comprised of low THC, and it's native to Central and Eastern Europe and Russia, and many accept it as its own species because its unique traits and phenotypes which distinguish it from the indica and the sativa plants, but it's widely debated as to whether it's a subspecies of sativa or not. And ruderalis is typically smaller than the other species. It rarely grows over 2 feet high. It's got thin, slightly fibrous stems with little branching, and the foliage is typically open with very large leaves. And it usually reaches maturity much quicker than the other species, and it typically matures between 5 to 7 weeks from seed. And so ruderalis was scientifically identified in 1924 in southern Siberia, but it grows in the wild. And the Russian botanist Januszewski was studying wild cannabis in the Volga River system, and he realized that he had come upon a third species. A lot are found in places where hemp was formerly grown. In the U.S., the most notable regions are in the Midwest. Ruderalis is used in folk medicine for depression mostly because it has the lowest THC of the other biotypes, and it's rarely used for recreational purposes. Most of the time, people cross it with strains that carry higher medicinal prescription use, like sativas or indicas. Ruderalis does have higher levels of CBD, and those higher levels are valuable for patients looking to treat anxiety or epilepsy, and it's being used as a form of cancer treatment as well as sclerosis and loss of appetite. So now let's talk about these two, indicas and sativas. Indicas have these wide, broad leaves that are deep in color. They're short and bushy, they have these thick, broad leaves, they have a very short growth cycle, and they're suitable for indoor growth. We typically find them near Central Asia, and they grow between 30 to 50 degrees latitude. The effects tend to be sedating and calming. And the symptom relief, we use it for anti-stress, sedation, sleep. It's physically soothing. And then sativas, on the other hand, have long, thin leaves. They're light in color. They're tall and thin, suitable for outdoor gardens. They typically grow between 0 to 50 degrees latitude. And the effect is uplifting. It's very creative with cerebrally focused effects. We would use this for depression, ADD, fatigue, or mood disorders. So when we're looking at the different cannabis strains, we notice the strains are commonly broken up into three groups: the indicas, the sativas, and they don't necessarily say the ruderalis, they say hybrids. So a hybrid of the indicas or the sativas, or a hybrid of either one of those with the ruderalis. So most of the consumers and what they call bud tenders use these weed types to predict effects. But we don't know if they're so accurate. Science is kind of pointing us to a better way of determining the effects of the cannabis strain and what it's going to do to you. We look at cannabinoids and terpenes. These are the compounds that make up this strain's chemical profile. So why do we still use indica and sativa and hybrid instead of the cannabinoid and the terpene model? Well, there's this big push in the cannabis industry to disavow the indica sativa hybrid classification system because it's not based on data and science. The terms are botanical names that refer to the plant's structure, not the effects that it produces. But most of the cannabis industry, including shops where people buy weed, is still stuck in classifying strains as either indicas, sativas, or hybrids for one main reason: it's easy. So you give a consumer three options: up, down, or in between. And you can easily explain how a certain strain will make them feel and sell them a product. But like it or not, the indica sativa hybrid classification system is still entrenched in the world. And both the models have value, and consumers of all levels can use both. For an easier, more general way to pick a strain and its effects, the indica sativa hybrid model may work. And once comfortable with cannabis, maybe they can dig into the nuances of marijuana a little bit more and learn about chemical profiles and cannabinoids and terpenes, which is the preferred method. So let's look at the differences here and the usefulness of the classification system. So indicas versus sativas. The common understanding of indicas and sativas is that indica strains are physically sedating, which is perfect for relaxing with a movie as a nightcap before bed. And sativa strains are energizing with uplifting cerebral effects that pair well with physical activity, social gatherings, or creative projects. Hybrid strains are thought to have a mix of indica and sativa effects. But indica doesn't always mean indicouch, and sativas don't necessarily energize all consumers. The origins of the two terms are actually rooted in botany, not the effects, and describe the physical structure of the plant. And on top of that, every person has a different body chemistry, so the strain can affect each person differently. But even today, the belief that indicas and sativas and hybrids deliver distinct effects is still rooted in that mainstream cannabis culture. So sativas, like I said, are thought to be energizing. They originally grew in warm, humid climates, growing long and lanky so that they can dry out and not absorb so much humidity. And their warm climate also means that they can take a long time to grow and flower or produce buds because the weather won't get cold and rainy at the end of the growing season. And while not all sativa marijuana strains will energize you, most consumers notice a tendency for sativas to produce a head high, an uplifting, stimulating effect. And they also report sativas as being helpful in mitigating stress or anxiety. And many consumers enjoy sativa to sharpen focus and boost creativity or motivation. So the common effects associated with sativa strains include feeling happy, uplifting, euphoric, and also energetic. And sativas are thought of as a daytime strain, used for feeling productive, creative, and focused, and getting your chores done. There's a lot of different sativa strains out there that you've likely heard of that are the most populars. Dispensaries stock some of these strains as they're generally a crowd favorite. These are Sour Diesel, Jack Herer, Green Crack, Durban Poison, and Strawberry Cough. There's also Amnesia Haze, Super Lemon Haze, and Tangy. Indicas are typically said to be relaxing, and they originally grew in cold northern climates. They grew short and dense because of their environment, and their growing life cycle is shorter, so they get harvested before the cold and the wet of the fall and the winter set in. So not all indica strains put you in the couch, but nevertheless, a lot of consumers associate indica with the body effect. For example, heavy limbs or a tingly face. And they also report indicas being helpful in aiding in relaxation and curbing insomnia. But the common effects associated with indica strains include feeling relaxed, euphoric, happy, and sleepy. And indica is known as a nighttime strain. It's used for relaxing and unwinding at the end of the night. So there's a lot of different indica strains that you might be familiar with. Ice Cream Cake, Purple Punch, Skittles, Granddaddy Purple, Bubba Kush, Northern Lights, Blueberry, and Grape 8. Hybrid strains are bred from both indica and the sativa descended plants. And due to a long history of crossbreeding cannabis, strains that have pure indica or pure sativa lineages are very rare. Most strains referred to as indica or sativa are in fact hybrids with genetics inherited from both types. So since these hybrid strains derive genetics from both the indicas and the sativas, their effects pull from both indica and sativa strains. Some common effects include feeling happy and euphoric, uplifted, energetic, and relaxing. It all depends on which hybrid you consume and what effects its parent strains produce. So looking at the hybrid's lineage, the parent strains, it may give you a better sense of what kind of effects it's going to produce. So, for example, if it has more indica in its lineage, it might have effects more associated with those strains, but that's not always the case. There's certainly no shortage of hybrid strains on the market, and some of the most popular ones are Wedding Cake, GG4, Blue Dream, Gelato, GSC, OG Kush, and GMO cookies. And as a side note, what we call hemp refers to the industrial, non-intoxicating varieties of the cannabis that's harvested primarily for the fiber, the seeds, the CBD, and the novel cannabinoids like Delta 8. And hemp's fiber can be used to make materials and textiles. Its seeds can even be eaten, and CBD and other novel cannabinoids can be extracted from it. And legally, like I said, hemp is any cannabis plant with less than 0.3% THC. So, weed is incredibly nuanced. Each strain has its own chemical profile that will interact differently with each person's body chemistry. The same strain could affect you and your smoking buddy completely differently. And the hybrid strains offer a mix of indica and sativa-like effects. So broadly speaking, you're going to see a lot of consistency to the idea that indicas are relaxing and sativas are energetic. And most of the strains in the sleepy and relaxed categories are indicas. And most of the energetic strains are sativas. But, let's dial in that process here. So let's talk about cannabinoids and terpenes for a second. If indica and sativa aren't the best predictors of effects, we know that there's a better way to pinpoint the effects of different strains is to talk about their mix of cannabinoids and terpenes, or the chemical compounds in it. And these compounds combine to create the entourage effect, and that leads to the feeling of being high. So listed here is kind of a chart that you can see the mix of the THC compound, the CBD compound, and what these different things help with. And this is kind of a way that I choose to remember that indica sativa hybrid model is indicas, think relaxing effects, indica couch. For sativas, think energizing effect. And then, there's no hard and fast rule here. Just focus on the effects of the user. We talk more about terpenes in another lesson, so I'm not really going to go into that here, but it's just important to note that these are what add to the aromas and the tastes of the different plants. And then I discuss growing and harvesting cannabis in more detail in a later lesson, but the main point here is that cannabis just consumes a lot of water and a lot of energy while it grows, and we really should just focus on more sustainable growing methods.